most famous tweet was when I said depression wasn't real. And I had A-list celebrities. I had the girl from Game of Thrones. I had fucking literally A-list guys. And everyone's telling me how dangerous my mindset is. What is dangerous about believing that you control your own mind? Because if you implement the 4 things I've just told you, depression becomes garbage. Depression's not a thing anymore. Feeling depressed is real. You can be depressed with your situation. I just told you, number 2, get depressed, that's fine. But believing you can fix it yourself is the important key. Sitting there believing that depression is some monster from the sky that strikes your brain and now you have no control over it and you must take pills every day is the absolute enemy to a G mindset. I don't give a fuck how depressing my situation. The only person who can change it is me. The only person who can change how I feel about my situation or try and affect the situation directly is me. Even if you put me in a situation I can't change, if you put me in jail and I'm depressed because I'm in jail, I still refuse to succumb to depression. I refuse to collapse mentally and give up. I know the only person who can control my mind is me. Nobody's coming to save me. No doctor with a pill is coming to save me. Depression isn't real. Depression is a state of mind designed to motivate you to find a life that doesn't depress you any further. That's all it is. Now you have to decide, are you man enough to go and get it done, or are you going to sit around and cry? And depression, the reason I talk about depression a lot is because depression in the Western world is the cure-all. It's the cure-all excuse. This is what people are using. My life's shit because I'm depressed. No, you're depressed because your life is shit. It's the other way around, and you're refusing to acknowledge that, and you want to sit there and live a shit life and pretend that some disease has struck you. And the reason you know that's bullshit, anyone out there who's depressed, I'll tell you something, you're not depressed, you're a coward. And the reason you're a coward is as follows. You desperately try to defend this crippling ailment you have. When I tell you depression isn't real, you message me pages and pages desperate to convince me I'm wrong, that depression is a real thing and that your life is terrible and this ailment has destroyed your life because you're desperate to defend your excuse. If depression was really terrible, you wouldn't want to defend it. If depression was really so bad and I'm telling you it's not real and I know how to fix you, and if you implement a mindset like mine, you become immune to depression. If depression was so terrible, you'd listen to me and think, I need to try what this guy does. I need to do. If he's immune to depression and it's impossible to depress him, I need to be like this man. But instead, no, you don't want to do that. You want to call me names and sit and defend this ailment because you know it's garbage. It's your excuse. It's your blanket. It's your shield. It's your excuse you get to pull out every time you look at your failure of a life. And that's why depression is absolutely and utterly not real. And anyone who's bought this course who thinks they're depressed, I'll tell you something now, drop that coward bullshit. If you're watching this and you're depressed, drop and give me 200 press-ups. Do 200 press-ups. Look in the mirror, look in your eyes and tell yourself you're the fucking man and drop that garbage because you can get absolutely nowhere in your life if you believe in that crap. Depression absolutely isn't real. And you're going to say this to people and they're going to fucking go nuts at you. They're going to call you arrogant, they're going to call you all the things they called me. But your life is going to be a life worth living.
You know, say you were running a depression camp, how would you get people out of their depression?
I get them out of the depression by making them understand the harsh realities of the world. And the harsh realities of the world is that life doesn't give a fuck about you. Life doesn't give a shit about you. If a lion goes to hunt some gazelle, let's say you're a lion and you're chilling, and you see a whole bunch of antelope in the corner. When the lions start chasing the antelope, they get the slowest, weakest antelope. They get the babies, they get the one who's sick, they get the one who's got a broken leg. They don't give a fuck. They're not gonna be like, oh, well, that one's sick, so we can't eat that one. Or that one didn't have breakfast, so it's unfair to chase that one down. The lion doesn't care. The lion gets the slowest antelope. And life's exactly the same. So you have to decide which antelope you want to be, because just like the lion, life doesn't give a shit who's at the back. And you have to decide if you want to be at the back and hope the lion's going to feel sorry for you when it's hungry, and you can tell him all your excuses just before he rips your throat out, or you can make sure you're the one at the front by any means necessary. And that's a choice you have to make. And when people truly understand that and they stop externalizing their problems, then they believe there's 2 choices. You either externalize your issues or you believe you have influence over your issues. When bad things have happened to me, when my father died or whatever, I never allowed myself to wake up and think, maybe I have depression. Because it wasn't even in my realm of possibility. It wasn't even ever in my sphere. It was like, I'm upset about this, and times of healing, whatever. I've got work to do. Let's get up, let's get done. And so I don't see why that's detrimental to anybody. The reason that people got so triggered and upset by what I said is because I attack their belief system. It's like attacking someone's God. It's their worldview. It shapes everything they do. Like if you believe in God or you believe in ghosts or you believe in depression, everything you do is influenced by this belief. And when you attack someone's belief, they're going to get very desperate to defend it. There's also a large body of evidence saying that depression doesn't exist. Feel free to, I don't want to quote it exactly, but I think his name is Lauren Mosher. He was the head of schizophrenic research at the Institute of Mental Health. So he's like the guy. And he concluded that depression is not a real disease because in 100% of cases, there's nothing actually wrong with the brain. He says, I can't detect anything wrong with the brain. All the brain scans they show you in depressed people, you can just take a brain scan of someone having an orgasm. Those are chemicals in the brain. You can see it. That does not mean that the person's got a mental disorder. You can see the depression in their brain because they've accepted they're depressed. The brain didn't change and then make them the depressed. People got the wrong way around. So yeah, of course, everyone feels depressed temporarily. I've been depressed. Bad things happen to everybody. You have a choice of let it consume you.
How did you snap out of your unhappiness, depression?
Well, I snapped out of it because I understand that it's the only choice there is.
Was there a method you did?
I don't think there's a specific method. You just have to be harsh about the realities of the world. Life doesn't give a fuck about you. Everyone who you're crying to your problems about doesn't really care. And you have to get it over with. Bad things happen to everybody. They're going to happen to everybody. And then we all die. So you have two choices. You can let the bad things consume you, or you can wake up one day and think, enough of this, and you got to push forward. And the crazy thing is when I say that to people say to me, oh, you're crazy. That is exactly how the entire world functioned until this new think bullshit came along. Until this new age crap came along, no one ever sat down and gave up. You look at World War II, people dying all over the place. Who gave up? Everyone just pushed, keep calm, carry on. There's bombs today, got to go to work. That's because that's how people were raised. But now this new think garbage has come and everyone tells me that I'm wrong. Well, we have you asking for the medical proof. The medical proof is the entirety of human history, where nobody ever was too depressed to work because they had to fucking eat. And people go on with things. When I was saying depression, I'm talking about the 19-year-old in their bedroom with nothing wrong with their life who's saying they're depressed. That's completely different to post-traumatic stress disorder, in my mind. Obviously, bad things can happen to people and they can affect you. Still, I believe you're a master of your own mind, but I think that's a much harder battle depending on what you went through. But it's really interesting you said that. I watched a TV show about a German girl who survived a plane crash in the 1970s in Peru. The plane blew up in the air or something, it crashed. When she was the only survivor, she woke up, she saw her decapitated mother next to her still strapped in the seat. Everyone's dead. She starts walking through the jungle trying to eat, ends up, because of her wounds, gets infection, ends up sure she's gonna die, passes out in a clearing, gets saved, blah, blah, blah. And they were talking to her what happened once she'd been saved, and she obviously eventually made it back to Germany. Her family originally thought she was dead. She said, well, what happened when you got back? And he said, well, my dad tried to sell a book, but no one bought it. So he told me I had to get a job because we needed work. We needed money. So about 2 weeks later I was working, like doing what? Oh, in a shop. And like, oh, did you go to a psychiatrist? She goes, no, we didn't do that. Like, you know what I mean? So this is one of the most dramatic things you can possibly go through. And she just went to a store, got a job, and got over it. Obviously she had her own personal battle, but she pushed forward, and now she's doing an interview at age 80 saying, yeah, well, you just have to get on with life. So and people are gonna tell me I'm wrong. I'm like, this is the evidence that it is possible.
There are activities that we can do that will give us healthy, sustained increases in dopamine, both the peaks when they happen and to maintain or even increase our baseline levels of dopamine. So how do we do that? What are some of these activities? Well, in recent years, there's been a trend toward more people doing so-called cold exposure. In part, this was popularized by Wim Hof, the so-called Iceman, getting into cold showers, taking ice baths, exposing oneself to cold water of various kinds, can in fact increase our levels of dopamine as well as the neuromodulator norepinephrine. This is not a new phenomenon. In the 1920s, a guy by the name of Vincent Prisnitz was one of the first people to popularize and formalize cold water therapies. He was an advocate of cold water exposure in order to boost the immune system and increase feelings of well-being. And actually, this practice dates back long before Vincent's popularized it. And Wim Hof is the more recent iteration of this. First of all, some of the safety parameters. Let's establish those first. Getting into very, very cold water, 30-degree Fahrenheit or even low 40-degree Fahrenheit, can put somebody into a state of cold water shock. I mean, people can die doing that. So obviously, you want to approach this with some caution. But for most people, getting into 60-degree water or 50-degree water, or if you're acclimated and comfortable with it, 40-degree water or 45-degree water can have tremendously beneficial results on your neuromodulator systems, including dopamine. What temperature of water you can tolerate will depend on how cold water adapted you are and how familiar you are with the experience of getting into cold water. And when I say comfortable with, I should mention there is never a case in which getting into cold water does not evoke a release of epinephrine. So the quickening of the breath, the widening of the eyes, the feeling as if you can't catch your breath, and even some physical pain at the level of the skin, that happens almost every time that you get into cold water, even if you're cold water adapted. What almost everybody knows and understands is that wall, as I like to refer to it, is coming. That's always the first experience of getting into cold water. There's no real way around that. Now, this study that I mentioned earlier, Human Physiological Responses to Immersion into Water of Different Temperatures, really interesting study that was done and published in the the European Journal of Applied Physiology. I can provide a link to that study in the show caption. It's a really interesting study. They looked at people getting exposed to water that was warm, moderately cold, or very cold. It was 32 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Celsius, or 14 degrees Celsius. You can just put those online and do the conversion, or you can do the conversion to Fahrenheit if you like. But in any case, what they looked at were the concentrations of things like epinephrine and dopamine and so on. And what they found was really interesting. First of all, upon getting into cold water, the changes in adrenaline and noradrenaline, epinephrine and norepinephrine, were immediate and fast, and these were huge increases. So that's the getting into the cold water that everybody experiences, these huge increases in adrenaline. But then what was interesting is they observed that dopamine levels started to rise somewhat slowly and then continued to rise and reach levels as high as 2.5 times above baseline. That's a remarkably high increase. Remember, if we go back to our examples of chocolate, sex, a doubling above baseline, nicotine, 2.5 times above baseline, cocaine, the increase in dopamine from cold water exposure of this kind was comparable to what one sees from cocaine, except in this case, it wasn't a rise and crash. It was actually a sustained rise in dopamine that took a very long time, up to 3 hours, to come back down to baseline, which is really remarkable. And I think this explains some of the positive mental and physical effects that people report subjectively after doing cold water exposure. One question that many of you are probably asking is, just how cold should the water be? Well, you could mimic what was done in this study and do 14 degrees Celsius, but for some people that won't be cold enough. For some people that will be too cold. They did look at the release of stress hormones like cortisol, in addition to the release of things like epinephrine and adrenaline. And it's interesting that they noted that in all cases, but especially at that coldest temperature, there was an increase in cortisol, but that it was transient, that eventually people's cortisol, the stress hormone, subsided a bit. There are basically two different approaches to remaining in the cold when it's uncomfortable. One is to try and relax yourself, to try and practice slow breathing, to try and dilate your gaze. I've talked about this before in previous podcasts, to go into panoramic vision, to essentially try and calm yourself so that it's not as stressful in the cold. Other people, however, take the approach of trying to ramp up their level of internal autonomic arousal, meaning to get really energized and kind of lean into the friction of the cold, and they find that easier. Other people distract themselves. They recite the alphabet, or they do anything to try and distract themselves from the discomfort. To be totally honest, it does not matter for sake of dopamine release, because the dopamine release is triggered and then continues even after you get out of the cold water. Now, in this study, it was long exposure to cold water. It was an hour. That's a long period of time. And I do warn you against getting into cold water that's so cold that it will make your temperature drop and make you hyperthermic for an hour. That actually could be dangerous for a lot of people. You might have a hard time reheating, and hypothermia is not a good thing. They had people monitoring subjects in these studies and paying attention to their core body temperature. They were able to reheat them afterwards. It's well established now that getting into cold water, whether or not it's a shower, an ice bath, circulating cold water, a stream, etc., that can evoke the norepinephrine release immediately and the long arc of that dopamine release. Why would that be good? Up until now, I've basically said getting increases in dopamine are detrimental to your baseline. Well, this does appear to raise the baseline of dopamine for substantial periods of time, and most people report feeling a heightened level of calm and focus after getting out of cold water. So cold water exposure turns out to be a very potent stimulus for shifting the entire milieu, the entire environment of our brain and body, and allowing many people to feel much, much better for a substantial period of time after getting out of the ice bath or cold water of any kind than they did before. Now, you might ask how often to do this. Some people do this every day. It can be very stimulating, so typically doing it early in the day is going to be better. I don't necessarily recommend doing it right before sleep, but some people do it in the afternoon, and some people will indeed do that 7 days a week. Other people 3 days a week. Other people every once in a while. What I can say is, once you become cold water adapted, once it no longer has the same impact of novelty and feeling a bit like I don't want to say a shock to your system, because you don't want to go into cold water shock, but once it is comfortable for you, then it will no longer evoke this release. There really does seem to be something in the pathway from cold water exposure through the norepinephrine pathway and into the mesolimbic brainstem that causes this release in dopamine. But nonetheless, it's a basically zero cost. I mean, you need access to water of some sort, cold water, shower, etc. But basically zero cost way of triggering a long-lasting increase in dopamine without ingesting anything, no pharmacology whatsoever. Please, again, approach it with safety and caution in mind, but it is a very potent stimulus. Again, 250% rise in baseline, 2.5 times rise in baseline rivals that of cocaine, which is really remarkable.